Welcome, dear participants, dear colleagues, to this webinar on the reform of the World Trade Organization, key priorities for the G20. My name is Axel Berger. I'm a senior researcher at the German Development Institute in Germany, in Bonn, and I'm a member of the Trade and Investment Research Network, TIRN, and it's my pleasure today to moderate this session. But first of all, let me hand over to Piercarlo Paduan and Said Akman for the welcome notes, and let me also very briefly introduce them to you. So Piercarlo Paduan is Vice President of the Istituto Affari Internazionale, IAI, and a non-executive member of the Board of Directors of UniCredit. And he's also a lead co-chair, or the lead co-chair of the T20 Italy task force on trade and investment and growth. So he will be, he's in charge of the task force where the three policy briefs that we are presenting today have been written and produced. Our second speaker, the second welcome note comes from Said Akman. Said is an associate professor of international trade and European integration and director of the G20 Studies Center at TEPAF. That's the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey. And he's also a co-chair of the T20 Task Force on Trade, Investment and Growth during the T20 Italy process. And Said is also a member of the steering committee of TIRN, the Trade and Investment Research Network, and obviously EIE and TIRN are the co-hosts of our webinar today. So that's all from me for now. Let me hand over to Piercarlo and Said. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Axel, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and thank you for showing so much interest in our work. Let me welcome all of you, both as a IAI Vice President, but also as a member of the T20 Task Force and lead co-chair, and to wish you a very good working seminar, given the fact that the topic you have looked at over these past few months is extremely important nowadays. It's actually, I would say, it's gaining increasing importance in the policy debate as the global system evolves, sometimes not exactly in the right direction we would like to see, but it's certainly evolving. And therefore, as we know from international governance, we know it must be managed, it must be governed. And this is what drives the T20 activity as also as a function of the G20 support function that the Italian G20 is asked the group. During the Italian presidency, the T20 Task Force on Trade, Investment and Growth has involved 79 authors working on 13 policy briefs on all kinds of issues related to world trade and investment. But certainly it is easy to maintain that the deep cross-cutting issue and the horizontal issue which provides a unifying framework for analysis of the trade issue is exactly WTO reform. WTO reform, maybe it's symbolic, not just for its own sake. We need a well-managed and open, fair trade system, but also the fact that the global system is evolving in ways, as I said, not always satisfying. So we need international institutions. We need international organizations within the context of the G20, which has, of course, gained prominence over the past decade or so, in not just in trade, but in growth, in macroeconomics, in financial stability, and of course, in issues such as taxes, and as now we know, in issues such as global health care. So it's extremely important that we think we provide contribution to how to redesign the WTO as a major institution in charge of many issues involving trade and investment, and help provide a framework for global value chains, which have been, of course, severely hit by the crisis. So I will stop there. I will wish you, as I said, a very good seminar, and thank you all of you for your contribution. Let me thank, however, in particular, Nicola Faganello, Chair of the G20 Trade and Investment Working Group, and Annabel Gonzalez, Deputy Director General of WTO, for their availability to participate. I thank you again for being with us, and good afternoon to everybody.
Thank you very much, Piercarlo, for providing the background of our webinar today and introducing the key challenges we face. And indeed, these are the topics that we are going to discuss today. Let me hand over to Said Akman for the second welcome note.
Thank you, Axel. Let me welcome all participants on behalf of TIRN, Trade and Investment Research Network. And on this occasion, let me tell a few words about this institution, which is co-organizing with the Institute of Fari. TIRN is a cross-country independent network of scholars specialized on trade and investment policy research, and whose shared goal is actually to provide substantive research-backed and evidence-based analysis to support the G20 leaders' deliberations. It actually has an online platform which you can access through G20-TIRN.org. And the aim of this event actually was to provide the discussion on the proposals produced by several policy briefs in this task force with the policymakers on the other side of the stage to help their endeavor in bringing an open, fair, and effective working trading system. And 13 policy briefs have been produced, and we are going to discuss 3 of them, which are more directly relevant to WTO and the reform debate about it. And we all believe that the doable ideas and developing doable ideas and turning them into practice is highly essential. So this is the reason why T20 was established by G20 as an outreach group with the open mission to provide policy recommendations and insightful analysis to the G20. So T20 needs to maintain a closer and more structured connection with the officials from G20 and with the key policy community in all G20 countries, so that they can address global challenges, particularly in these difficult times. And in trade matters, our connection with the Trade and Investment Working Group is important. This is the most appropriate body in order to turn the ideas into some kind of action. This close connection with G20 and the working group is vital for the scholars, for researchers, for thinkers. That's Team 20, for 2 main reasons, I believe: to be informed about the issues that are discussed among the policy makers, and to enable a more effective dissemination of policy recommendations. Today, the problems WTO is facing are not new, and we all know that WTO is argued to lose its centricity in governing global trade. And I think this is understandable in this challenging times, because trade patterns are becoming much more complex in time, and the rules and procedures need to be properly implemented. And moreover, new rules need to be adapted to address the transformation in the system. As Dr. Ngozi, the Director General, stated previously, the WTO rulebook is outdated, and this leads us to politicization of trade policies and more trade conflicts. So how to restore it to be more relevant to the realities of our time, especially in several controversial and dividing issues, like market distorting policies, from subsidies to export restrictions. Especially, we have to consider them while respecting different developmental models and preserving core values of the system. It might be easy to talk about the need for WTO reform, because there have been a lot of proposals tabled so far, but we need more feasible actions to realize the reforms. And I think member states should proceed with the reforms rather than merely talking about them and putting alternative ways of doing things instead of multilateral trading system. But member states, unfortunately, have dissent on the nature of the reforms, because we see that they define the challenges a bit differently. So reconciliation is not an easy process. However, the policy briefs here in this occasion, as the task force, we propose some practical recommendations to address some of these challenges. And I, in that occasion, just raised 3 questions at this point, which are the main focus of the coming 3 policy briefs that will be discussed by our panelists. The first one is, how can we confront deglobalization in the trading system and prevent further politicization of trade policies while recognizing the diversity of legitimate interests among the member states and the major stakeholders, and which particular disciplines or areas can be addressed based on the experiences of these stakeholders in their regional or mega trade agreements. The second question is about the one challenging issue in the WTO, which is about trade negotiations. The WTO, as a forum for negotiations, as one of its main functions, is argued to lose its effectiveness in the last 2 decades, with only few agreements produced in the last 2 decades. So could some other initiatives like plurilaterals enable parties to develop new rules that we need in areas where consensus building is hard to achieve, and while maintaining, on the other hand, the inclusiveness, because many of the developing countries we know are not participating in these plurilaterals. And thirdly is the issue of the status of development, a very challenging issue nowadays. The special and differential treatment become such an issue as many developing countries started to firmly engage in the global economy and become major stakeholders, players of the system. This is good, but do we need some objective criteria to define their graduation, to measure the level of development, or can we solve it through more flexible or needs-oriented methods? I think these are 3 questions the policy briefs will mainly discuss with our policymaking community. And on this occasion, let me finish. And before passing it over to Axel, I would like to thank also Ms. Annabel Gonzalez and Mr. Faganello for participating and discussing the policy briefs with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Said, for your welcome note, and indeed for kind of already providing the framing of our webinar today and the key guiding questions that are really on the table today. So I do not have to introduce the framework of the webinar again. Let me welcome our speakers, and let me emphasize that this is a very exciting dialogue between excellent researchers on the one hand, from different world regions who are lead authors of policy briefs focused on WTO reform. I will introduce them later on before their inputs. And 2 excellent policymakers and very relevant policymakers on the other side. The chair of the G20 Trade Investment Working Group, Nicola Faganello, and the Deputy Director General of the WTO, Ms. Annabel Gonzalez. So, and they will reflect on the proposals that are put on the table by the researchers. So, in my view, this is what the T20 is about, to bring these 2 spheres together and to reflect on the issues and the key recommendations that we should put on the table for the policymakers and for the leaders ahead of the Rome G20 summit later in the year. So before I hand over to our first speaker, let me also emphasize that we would like to have a lot of discussions with you, with the participants, and please use the Q&A function of Zoom to let us know what kind of questions you have for the speakers. Also, if you have comments, please let us know. Post them in the Q&A function, and I'll introduce them if there's time, and I as a moderator, I will make sure that there's time, asking the panelists to really limit their initial interventions, but hopefully there will be many more interventions during our webinar. Okay, so please feel free to use the Q&A function, and I should hand over to our first speaker. This is Ms. Claudia Schmucker, and Claudia is head of the Geoeconomics program at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and Claudia is also a member of TIRN. And so she will introduce the key recommendations of a T20 policy brief that she co-authored as part of the T20 Italy process. So Claudia, let me ask you, what is the role of plurilateral negotiations for WTO reform? And what are your key recommendations for the G20 leaders? Claudia, floor is yours. Over to you.
Axel, thank you very much for the introduction, and I hope to be brief enough so we have ample time for the discussion afterwards. So I'm very happy to answer your question based on the findings of our policy brief, which was co-authored by Said Akman, Fabrizio Botti, Peter Draper, Andreas Freitag, and you. So in order to restore the central role of the WTO in global trade, it is necessary, in our view, to revive the negotiating function of the organization. Here, in our view, plurilateral agreements can be an important stepping stone towards closer multilateral integration on issues where multilateral consensus is not yet in sight. In our paper, we therefore looked at all past and present plurilateral agreements, which were initiated under the GATT and early WTO, like the Government Procurement Agreement or the Information Technology Agreement, at plurilateral agreements which were initiated during the Doha round, such as TISA or the Environmental Goods Agreement, and lastly, at the 4 joint statement initiatives. And here what we found is that plurilateral agreements are largely initiated by developed countries, while the developing countries are less willing or less equipped to participate. This situation must change if the WTO is to be sustainably modernized through plurilateral agreements. And in our policy brief, we therefore, based on our findings, developed a set of practical recommendations on how to successfully initiate and negotiate inclusive plurilateral agreements that serve the interest of all members, especially including developing countries. The first point that we make is make development aspects and the concerns of the developing country a high priority when you launch a plurilateral agreement and also during the negotiations. I'm happy to further elaborate that during the discussion. Second point that we found was really relevant: conduct inclusive and transparent negotiations. Members of plurilateral agreements need to make sure that countries that are not part of the agreement are not negatively affected. To achieve this, negotiations need to be open at all stages for new members. The negotiation chairs should also reach out to non-members to address their concerns and remove possible hurdles for further participation. And given the controversial nature of plurilateral agreements, negotiating members should also increase transparency, and not only to the broader WTO membership, but also to the general public as well, to create trust. Our third point, clarify the legal status of plurilateral agreement. A legal clarification for the incorporation of plurilateral agreements into the WTO framework is important prior to launching new initiative. It is essential to counter arguments that plurilateral agreements generally are incompatible with WTO law. This is lacking under the current joint statement initiatives. This will pose a problem, and we suggest that this should be changed for future negotiations. Fourth point, increase coordination between different plurilateral initiatives. Currently, we see a number of plurilaterals that are negotiated in parallel with insufficient coordination, and this increases the risk of creating duplicating or even contradictory commitments. And to avoid this situation, it is necessary to increase the cooperation at the launch of new plurilateral agreements, ideally on the basis of a given set of criteria, and to establish coordinating meetings among the chairs of the different plurilateral tracks at a regular basis. Lastly, conduct ex-ante impact assessment and ex-post evaluation. It is important for WTO members, and particularly for developing countries, to know about the potential risks and benefits prior to joining the negotiations. And it is useful to evaluate past plurilateral initiatives and draw lessons from them for future negotiations. As such, we suggest that the WTO Secretariat prepares an annual report assessing the implications of plurilateral negotiations for the participating members. Final point, what is the role of the G20 in this regarding plurilateral negotiations? The informality of the G20, in our view, provides an opportunity to exchange views, to establish trust, and to possibly find common ground on plurilateral negotiations. And to enhance these discussions in the group of the G20, we suggest the establishment of a subcommittee under the G20 Trade and Investment Working Group on plurilateral initiatives. Here, the G20 countries could also reflect on new initiatives that are in the interest of the broader membership, like, for example, essential health products or the reduction of food export barriers. And we hope that through these kind of recommendations that we propose, we will have more inclusive plurilateral agreements in the future, which help to modernize the WTO as an organization. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for your excellent presentation and for sticking to the time. So 5 minutes, perfect. Perfect timing. Let me ask you a follow-up question, because I mean, one of the key aspects is that so far many of these plurilateral initiatives have been driven by industrialized countries. So you've mentioned that the development dimension should be strengthened as part of these plurilateral initiatives. How? What should be done?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned, empiric evidence indicates that plurilateral agreements, as you said, are largely developed by industrial countries, while developing countries are less equipped or less willing to participate. And this needs to change if we want to use the plurilateral track to modernize the WTO. Then we need inclusive plurilateral agreements. The first point, less equipped, points to capacity problems of developing countries. And here we have several suggestions on how to alleviate them. Among others, we first propose that it would be useful to expand existing funds of developed countries or emerging market economies that are in the position to do so, to support developing country officials from Geneva-based missions and capital. During the negotiations, we suggest that the negotiating chairs reach out regularly, particularly to developing countries, to address their concerns and remove possible problems for participation. And finally, continue with online negotiations. That was started during the COVID pandemic out of necessity because people couldn't meet. We still believe in-person meetings are important, but additional online negotiations can help address capacity problems of developing countries, because then we can also have experts from the capitals participate in the negotiations. In the policy brief, we also addressed the issue of developing countries being less willing to participate. And to ease existing concerns regarding new plurilateral commitments, we also suggest the following. As I said before, this WTO Secretariat should prepare reports about potential risks and benefits, because this is essential to make fact-based decisions on whether to participate in a plurilateral. And this is very important for developing countries. In addition, we suggest to use the tailor-made approach towards special and differential treatment that was applied in the Trade Facilitation Agreement as a useful model to address implementation concerns of developing countries. And we hope that these recommendations regarding capacity problems and regarding the willingness to commit to further commitments will lead to more inclusive plurilateral agreements in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Claudia. And I was in parallel also already observing the Q&A box, and I noticed a couple of questions already on plurilaterals. I took note, and I will make sure that that we discuss them later on in the discussion. But perhaps others would like to pick up them already in their presentations. So let's move on. Let's let's discuss the next topic, the next policy brief, and let me turn over to Carlos Primo Braga. He's adjunct professor of the Fundação Dom Sebral in Brazil and managing director of the Wgo Consultoria Empresarial Limited. Sorry, my Portuguese is not the best one. In Sao Paulo, and among other things, obviously, Carlos has a very distinguished career, and he had a long and distinguished career, in particular at the World Bank. And Carlos is also a lead author of the policy brief that he's discussing today. And so, Carlos, let me pose the following question to you. In your view, how does the process of deglobalization affect the role and relevance of the WTO? And what are your key recommendations for the G20 leaders to address these challenges? Carlos, the floor is yours. Looking forward to your initial input.
Thank you, Axel. It's a pleasure to once again participate in a T20 webinar. I and my 8 co-authors, so we are talking of people with lots of experience in dealing with the WTO, be it in academia, be it as former WTO ambassadors, one former deputy director general, and from all over the world. And I'm not going to have the time to introduce all of them. When the paper is made public, you'll see that we have several of the participants in this seminar involved one way or another. These are Alejandro Hara, Bosco Taran, Doug Lippold, Fernando De Matteo, Giorgio Sacerdote, Leonardo Borlini, Sait Ackman, and Uri Dadush. Well, the question that was posed by the paper, and the title of the paper is Confronting Deglobalization in the Multilateral Trade System. The bottom line, the basic message of the paper is that investing in the improvement of the rules-based multilateral trading system and its main institutional anchor, the WTO, is of critical importance if we are going to limit the damage of a process of deglobalization. And in this context, we know that the 21st century has been characterized so far by a series of disruptions in terms of trade and investment flows, beginning with the terrorist attack in September 11, 2001, the pandemic nowadays. So these are exogenous shocks to the system, but we also had systemic shocks like the global financial crisis. And also we had attitudes of many countries that adopted protectionist policies in the last few years, in many cases at odds with multilateral disciplines. There is a consensus that we need a reform in the WTO, be it to update the rule book, to clarify rules in areas where frictions have emerged, for instance, subsidies, state-owned enterprise, be it to cover gaps. Some are very old gaps, like agricultural trade, services, but also with respect to new areas like e-commerce. And in this context, of course, one area of particular concern is with the restoration of proper activities of the dispute settlement system, and in particular, its appellate body. So the recommendations of the brief are as follows. First, national security considerations should not be abused, particularly those that have a clear characteristic of beggar thy neighbor policies, like, for instance, export restrictions, mercantilist devaluation of the national currency. So these are activities, then the G20 has an important role in this context to put an out on this type of activities. Second, to learn from the experience of regional trade agreements. There are many areas, be it with respect to services disciplines, be it with respect to advance on institutes, on the promotion on environmental protection, be it with respect to e-commerce. So there are lessons to be learned. And it's not only with respect to regional trade agreements. I would call attention to the China-EU Comprehensive Agreement on Investment that has not yet been ratified, but that has a series of advances in areas like rules on subsidies and state-owned enterprise, disciplines on technology transfer requirements. So the basic message is that we should use the WTO to pursue convergence and coordination of in areas where formal binding is not yet possible. Another recommendation is to consider multilateral disciplines for state-owned enterprise based on the results of some of the regional agreements like CPTP and the USMA. There are lessons to be learned there. Update the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, adopting, for instance, an illustrative list of public bodies. Of course, as I already mentioned, fix the crisis with the dispute settlement system, focusing on the questions raised around the appellate body. We believe that Ambassador David Walker from New Zealand proposed quick fix is the right way to advance in this area. Also, we believe that it's needed to create incentives for WTO members to fully comply with their notification objectives. The Secretariat should be much more involved in this process. And last but not least, we need to pursue a more flexible approach with respect to plurilaterals, as Claudia already mentioned. Of course, there are many issues in terms of their consistency with the Marrakesh Agreement, but we believe that there are ways to advance in this agenda. So we have to move from a mindset where everyone has to agree on everything for any deal to be struck to one where deals are struck as waypoints towards the ultimate objective. And in reality, the WTO rulebook already has this kind of approach, be it with respect to regional trade agreements, be it with respect to special and differential treatment. So just to conclude, we have also to rekindle the interest of the private sector in the multilateral trade system, because I always remember when I retired from the World Bank and went to become a professor at IMD in Lausanne, in one of the CEO roundtables, I asked to several CEOs from large companies what word would come to their minds when I mentioned WTO. And the word more commonly referred to was frustration. So we have also to adapt to the reality of international trade and investment flows in the 21st century. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your thoughtful ideas that you've put on the table, challenging recommendations, I would assume. So let me ask you, do you believe there's enough goodwill among the key actors? I mean, the key actors in the WTO, the key trading nations like China, US, EU, Japan, at this stage to really secure significant investment in the strengthening the institutional anchor, the WTO. So, in your view, is there enough support by those big trading nations?
Well, the answer to your question, as in most things in life, is yo, a combination of yes and no. It is true that we are facing a very difficult situation in terms of the lack of trust among some of the key trading partners in the world. And not for a moment I'm suggesting that only them matter for the reform of the WTO. But we know that for the health of the liberal trading system and the multilateral rules, the key actors have to be engaged. And that's why I mentioned the China-EU agreement, comprehensive agreement on investment. It's not on trade, but it has several issues that suggest possibility of progress, even among countries that have very different political regimes. So I'm trying to continue to be an optimist. What I know for sure is that if we do not advance this process of reform in a way that makes the WTO more relevant and able really to address some of the key issues that we currently face, this inevitably will create additional noise in terms of international trade, investment, and capital flows.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your views, and I'm very much excited what our policymakers how they will respond to your recommendations. I noticed that there were more questions in the Q&A function, so please keep on writing, keep on sending your questions. I'll introduce them later on, and they are pretty challenging. So I recommend the speakers to take a look and to check the questions. Excellent and challenging questions. Thanks so much so far. But let's turn to the third speaker, to Jingquan. Jingquan is Dean and Professor of the China Institute for WTO Studies at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing, China, a very renowned institution. And Jingquan is also a member of TIRN. And I'd like to ask you, Jingquan, what are constructive approaches to the development status of members and special and differential treatment reform in the WTO? So we are very much looking forward to your responses and the kind of recommendations you and your team of co-authors came up with on these issues. The floor is yours, Jingquan.
Okay, thank you for the introduction and the question, Axel. I'm going to share with you our answers in the policy brief, co-authored by 5 scholars from Brazil, China, and Australia, led by Ms. Tatiana Prazres. Our policy brief is trying to address one of the most formidable and fundamental challenges for the WTO. The root cause of this problem is that there is no WTO definition for developing and developed members, but rather a long-established practice of WTO members self-designating their development status. Developing country status supposedly entitles members to SDT or more flexible and favorable conditions in WTO agreements. The United States has been especially vocal in asserting that self-declaration damages the negotiation function of the WTO, because developed countries are then reluctant to make concessions to small economies if large emerging ones also benefit from such flexibilities. In that spirit, in November 2019, so the United States proposed that what it saw as a criteria for determining which members could not avail themselves of SDT in current or future WTO negotiations. However, most developing country members oppose foregoing the right to self-designate their development status. Consequently, they are against fixed criteria defining whether they should be treated as a developing or developed member and therefore entitled to SDT. The heated debates about developing member status and the SDT have contributed to eroding trust and goodwill among members in Geneva. Development status disagreements pose a challenge to current and future trade negotiations and affect the prospects for WTO reform. This policy brief argued that the approach to set fixed criteria is unlikely to succeed. More than a distraction, there will be never-ending discussions around the most appropriate metrics to measure development that will further undermine trust among members without bearing fruit. This policy brief therefore defends a pragmatic issue-by-issue approach to address development status and the SDT in the WTO based on past experience and new creative solutions. Instead of negotiating fixed criteria, we argue that in current and future negotiations, WTO members should concretely consider this issue under discussion and design the SDT architecture most suitable to the case in hand. Flexibility and need would be the key feature of this new approach. Real needs are more important than development status. It follows the logic that a one-size-fits-all approach makes no sense. Arguably, even developed countries could benefit from this kind of flexibility if tightly circumscribed. In fact, the existence of tariff peaks in commitments of developed members, for example, is a sign that such an approach would not be complete novelty. We argue that different types of agreements require different types of SDT architectures. For market access SDT in the form of tariffs on goods or market access in services sectors, members should discuss in concrete terms how individual members could design their implementation schedules. For regulatory SDT, which refers to provisions for special and differential treatment in agreements that include rule-related disciplines, each developing country member should be allowed for tailor-made flexibilities decided individually. For the plurilateral negotiations, as discussed earlier, given the nature of them, members can only withdraw from a negotiating process or opt not to join a given plurilateral outcome if they do not wish to support it. In that sense, discussions about development and SDT become less critical in the context of plurilateral negotiations because to a large extent, the possibility of SDT being used as a threat to block discussions is less straightforward in such a negotiating modality. However, plurilaterals should contain incentives for members, including developing ones, to participate. Hence, innovative, flexible, tailor-made SDT provisions should be a feature of such future agreements. But for our proposal to work in practice, some elements need to be present. A political will to revive the negotiation function on both sides would be needed. It would also take the leadership of key G20 developing and developing country members to champion such an approach, sidestepping the unfruitful path of reclassifying developing country members. The proposed approach should apply to future agreements only. Existing SDT provisions, especially those for LDCs, should not be changed except as a result of specific negotiations. G20 leaders could task their trade ministers and other WTO members to develop the ideas proposed by this policy brief and to capture such understanding in a statement or paragraph of the G20 leaders' declaration. That would provide much needed guidance and political support to negotiators in Geneva. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jingquan, for your ideas on development status in SDT and what can be done in order to have a more constructive approach. Kind of already alluded to the role of the G20, but let me ask you. I mean, in particular, what should the G20 and in particular the policymakers in the Trade Investment Working Group and also the leaders, obviously, when they meet in Rome in a couple of weeks, in a couple of weeks' time, what should they do exactly? So what should they do to advance the proposed approaches that you've just put on the table?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think G20 members, leaders could make a lot of concrete statements in the meeting. For example, they should recommit to the WTO and its negotiating function, actually, which is on the serious question by a lot of countries. And they should express the commitment to undertake a more pragmatic, flexible, and tailor-made approach to SDT and call for such an approach in the WTO. Furthermore, they can express the shared view that the ultimate goal of SDT is to facilitate the integration of all members to the trading system in a manner consistent with their needs and capacities. They should acknowledge that all the G20 countries, these leading developing and developed countries, are ready to assume responsibilities commensurate with their level of development. Maybe more importantly, they should acknowledge that the self-designation of development status in SDT would not preclude such an approach. And also, they should underscore that existing SDT obligations remain unchanged, because right now the discussions are not so clear whether they are about the existing SDT or the future SDT. And also, they should encourage all WTO members participating in plurilateral and multilateral initiatives to take a new approach to SDT in ongoing and future negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Qingquan. So these were the recommendations by the scholars of the T20. And I should also mention that the policy briefs that the authors mentioned will be published soon, I believe mid-September, so in a couple of days' time, on the website of the T20 Italy. And I believe our colleagues from the Secretariat already have sent you the link where you can find the publications. But if you would like to read them right now, please do not hesitate to drop us an email, and we'll make sure that you get an advanced draft of the papers so that you know what these papers are about. So, okay, these were the recommendations by the scholars. I'm now very, very much excited to hear from the policymakers what they make of these suggestions. They should put these suggestions in the context of policymaking. So what is actually being discussed at the Trade Investment Working Group during the Italian G20 process, what is being discussed in the WTO. So we are very much looking forward to your responses to these recommendations, and obviously also your thoughts on what needs to be done to reform the WTO, and what can the G20 do in order to foster and support WTO reform. And I must say we have two very, very excellent and distinguished policymakers here with us today. And let me introduce first of all Nicola Faganello. Mr. Faganello is the chair of the Trade Investment Working Group, so the key person in order to when it comes to trade investment issues during the Italian G20 presidency. And Mr. Faganello is also Deputy Director General for the European Union and Director for International Trade Policy at the Italian Ministry for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. So, Mr. Faganello, we're very much looking forward to your input, to your responses. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Axel. And first of all, let me thank you for inviting me as chair of the G20 Trade Ministers Working Group to this interesting and timely webinar discussion. And we also thank all the participants for their stimulating contributions and observations. As you mentioned in my intervention, I will briefly present the goals, the status, and the perspective of the work going on in the Trade Ministers Working Group. And we will therefore, I'm afraid, present a much more realistic, probably low-key, and less maybe ambitious and exciting scenario compared with the contents or the different interventions and contribution I heard so far. But I believe that I will present still an important picture of what is an exercise. It's a very useful exercise in order to favor a successful meeting of the ministerial conference at WTO in the end of this year, which will be a key moment for the future of the WTO and of the multilateral trading system. So the G20 Italian presidency goal in the trade track is to put trade and investment and at service of the people, planet, and global prosperity, as we say in our motto, in the motto of our presidency. We actually want to reaffirm our active engagement to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on trade and investment. This is one of our priority, of course, and contribute to laying a solid foundation for the future sustainable economic recovery. Despite the disruptions caused to the world economy by the COVID-19 outbreak, the international trading system preserved actually its operability, and therefore, while recognizing there is still a long way to go to strengthen and make our global supply chains more resilient and sustainable, we also acknowledge the results of the international trading system as achieved since the onset of the pandemic. And we therefore remain committed to free and fair trade. They are convinced that these times of challenge should at the same time represent a major change for a greener, more equitable, and more inclusive growth. In particular, we intend to, in the G20, to reaffirm our commitment to strengthen multilateralism and to support the rule-based, non-discriminatory, and transparent multilateral trading system with the WTO at its core. The very concept and term of WTO reform is itself a matter of discussion, as has been said also by previous speakers, and also among the G20 members. WTO reform proposals refer to those submitted with the aim of improving the efficiency, role, and reputation of WTO. The G20 actually has already in the past editions, in the past presidency, repeatedly called for improving the reform in WTO since 2015 in Antalya, the summit in Antalya, then 2018 in Buenos Aires, and in Japan in the year after. And most lately, last year, the Saudi Arabian presidency stepped up the discussion by launching the so-called Riyadh initiative on the future of the World Trade Organization, which aimed at providing an additional opportunity for G20 members to work constructively toward the reform of WTO, including in the lead-up of the MC12 Ministerial Conference at WTO. The reform proposals that will be discussed concern the various aspects of the discussion on WTO reform, including institutional issues, procedures, process, but also substantive norms. In the first meeting of the G20 Trade Ministers Working Group held in March, we dealt with trade and health issues, which, as I say, are very important in the present context of the economy and trade, in particular on how to strengthen the resilience of the global value chains of medical and pharmaceutical products, including vaccines, of course. We also discussed how to promote services, including digital trade and investment facilitation as channels of growth. And finally, we also explored how to increase the small and medium enterprises presence in global markets, taking into account the green and digital transition. In the second meeting of the Trade Ministers Working Group, we discussed the environmental sustainability of trade, a subject which is highly topical and still quite controversial, and which includes also the ongoing fisheries subsidies negotiations, which are a key element for the ministerial WTO. And we also debated on the influence of government support and on the level playing field, another very critical issue. Finally, we discussed the WTO reform, and we tried to circumscribe here the discussion to institutional issues as substantive issues were treated separately. In terms of substantive issues, the views of the membership in the G20 remain divergent, as you know, probably, but there was still a consensus that the negotiations on fishery subsidies and the nexus between trade and health constitute the priorities in terms of deliverables of the successful MC12, so priority of our discussions. When it comes to institutional issues, following up to the Riyadh initiative, which I mentioned before, on the future of WTO, The members of G20 agreed on the need for the G20 to maintain political momentum to reform the WTO, and there was a broad support to the need to reinvigorate the three functions of the WTO: monitoring, negotiating, and settling disputes, and to have, to this purpose, an open and constructive debate on institutional issues, including transparency and notification, which are very important elements across the board of our discussion, and establishing an inclusive process on the way forward. Now, in the coming weeks and months before the G20 ministerial, and after that before the MC12, the G20, and more generally the WTO members, together with the WTO Secretariat and with the different international organizations and interested players, including of course the T20 and the different think tanks involved in this process, we will have to engage constructively and realistically to concretely implement the commitment that everybody has confirmed lately to reform and relaunch the Geneva Organization. We will therefore continue our works on these issues, including Wto Reform, in two more meetings of the Investment Working Group that are planned before the ministerial conference in Sorrento on the 12th of October. The first will be in video conference in September, and the last one will be like the days before the ministerials in Sorrento. And in these negotiations and discussion, our common goal will remain to prepare a ministerial statement which will provide a political strong message and momentum to improve the multilateral trading system, also through the reform of WTO, which is a key element, of course, and to send a strong positive message of political engagement and urgency for the success of the MC12. Obviously, it's not up to the G20 to dictate elements of the reform. We need to involve WTO members in an inclusive way, as was mentioned before, and take place in WTO itself. However, we believe that the G20 could play a useful political stimulus to achieve a wide critical mass supporting the reform process of the Geneva Organization, which represents the architrave of the multilateral trading system. And the G20 Trade Ministerial in Sorrento, we therefore aim to have a G20 members recognizing that the reform should improve all the functions of the WTO in order to contribute to a predictability and security in the multilateral trading system, and to launch at the MC12 a reform process which will be a critical milestone for the radicalization of the WTO, and to preserve, which is the most important goal right now, strengthen and modernize the multilateral trading system and the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faganello, for your comprehensive overview. What is on the negotiation table at the Trade Investment Working Group, and this was very much helpful to anchor our discussion and to get a sense of what is actually being discussed, and in also in light of the recommendations that were put on the table by our three scholars. So let me now turn to Annabel Gonzalez and to reflect on the policy recommendations, but also to reflect on the policy process at the G20, at the WTO. But first of all, let me introduce Annabel. Annabel is a Deputy Director General of the WTO since recently. She has been a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and she had also a very distinguished career at the World Bank and had been a senior director of the global practice on trade and competitiveness. So Annabel, the floor is yours. We are very much looking forward to your thoughts about the reform of the WTO and the role of the G20.
So thank you very much, Axel, for the invitation. I am delighted to be part of this conversation with former T20 colleagues. If it were not by accident, I would have been a happy co-author of at least one of these papers, but then I became WTO DDG. So in a recent op-ed on what caused the trade policy revolution underpinning hyperglobalization, Paul Krugman makes the point that ideas matter and that they can have huge effects. These papers and their policy recommendations, as relevant, innovative, and pragmatic as they are, provide, in my view, excellent material to inform policies that can transform the trade and investment landscape. I hope that you will get to disseminate them broadly, and that G20 will be listening. Political guidance from the G20 could be very powerful to support WTO reform, of course. So I will focus my remarks on 3 points, building on each of the papers and on some interesting things that I have seen in the WTO in the short time that I have been in the organization. So first on plurilateral agreement. So what's going on? Since their launch at the end of 2017, negotiations of what are called the joint statement initiatives have made significant advancements. With, I have to say, a lot of energy and enthusiasm in the room. And each discussion is evolving in its own way, maybe showcasing different options as to how to negotiate in a plurilateral setting and how to potentially incorporate results in the WTO framework. Not in an organized way, maybe as the paper does, but in a bit more of a messy way, as things normally happen in a reality. Yeah? In the case of domestic services regulation, following a recent decision by a large member to formally join the negotiations, the initiative has moved a very important step closer to delivering an outcome by MC12. Participants are aiming to issue a reference paper with a clean set of disciplines as soon as possible, and then to focus on the preparation and exchange of revised draft schedules in time for MC12. The objective continues to be to agree on a package of final schedules at MC12. On investment facilitation for development, over 100 members participate in the JSI, including all G20 economies except India, South Africa, and the US, many developing countries, and 19 least developed country members. The initiative is pro-multilateral, with participants aiming at including as many members as possible. And the negotiations are open to all WTO members, and usually between 10 to 20 non-GSI participants attend the plenary meetings. There is a convergence text on which negotiations are taking place. And the focus of participants is to advance and clean the texts as much as possible to achieve a concrete outcome by MC12. On e-commerce, 86 members are currently negotiating trade-related rules on electronic commerce. Members have been making progress in cleaning some of the text. The objectives are clear, I think, and there is a certain degree of convergence, but differences remain in terms of overall level of ambition, as well as on the specific issues such as customs duties on electronic transmissions, data-related topics, and market access. There are some challenging issues here, but the participants guided by the co-conveners are aiming at announcing significant progress in MC12. So that's sort of like some points that I want to highlight related to the first paper. Second, on special and differential treatment, we know that sorting out this issue, or the controversy around this issue, is important for strengthening the negotiating function. The paper makes some valuable contributions to the discussions that, while innovative, are also anchored in WTO experience. And let me just take the example of the Information Technology Agreement, precisely because next week we will have a big event to celebrate 25 years of a very successful agreement. ITA, with 82 developed and developing member countries, has facilitated rapid growth of trade in ICT products. ITA has made ICT products more affordable and accessible. ITA membership facilitates integration into global production chains. And Vietnam, for example, is probably one of the most salient examples, and is now ranked number 8 in the world in terms of leading IT service providers. And of course, ICT products have played a critical role in the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The paper also refers to the TFA agreement, which we all know. And I think that fisheries subsidies discussions may provide an opportunity for some emerging economies to put in practice another case of a pragmatic approach to the topic. And my last comment refers to one of the issues tackled in the second paper presented by Carlos, and I think here, taking a leaf from members' experience in other negotiating fora at both the bilateral and regional levels can indeed inform WTO discussions, and they do, because ultimately members have the same interest, depending on not really that dependent on the forum, but more on a substantive basis. It can also work the other way around, with WTO provisions impacting negotiations at the regional and bilateral levels. But one issue is important, and in negotiating new rules, addressing the appellate body impasse is at the top of members' priorities. And this is something that is, of course, well known. Members are looking towards understanding the kinds of reforms that they wish or they need to realize for dispute settlement system, so that all pillars of the WTO can work better for member governments and for the people that they represent. A post-MC12 work program or roadmap has been suggested as a potential deliverable in December to resolve this underlying issue and restore confidence in a binding, fully functional dispute settlement system at the WTO. So with that, let me stop here, Axel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle, for providing your thoughts on the three policy briefs and the recommendations, but also to providing a little bit of flavor of what is being discussed in Geneva, in particular ahead of the next ministerial meeting, which I believe will be a very, very important one. So thank you very much for all your thoughts and your inputs. And I think it's now time to hear, or at least to read, what the participants have to say and what's on their mind. I took note of a couple of questions. I'd like to cluster them a little bit, and I'd like to start with the issue of plurilaterals. And so one question, one key question, obviously, came from Agustin Peter, and he asked, what about the legality of plurilateral? So you may know that two important members of the WTO question two important members question the legality of the plurilateral. So how would you respond? That's one question on plurilaterals. The second one, and that perhaps also relates to the recommendation by Claudia, that members of the WTO and those driving the plurilateral negotiations should make sure that developing countries are well represented. Isn't that a dilemma, right? When you increase the number of members of these plurilateral negotiations, will you end up in a situation that you have with regard to plurilateral, multilateral discussions, that consensus is really difficult to reach? So these are two questions on plurilaterals, and I'm looking around at the virtual table who would like to pick up those questions. Obviously, I'm looking in particular towards Claudia, but I also invite the others to come in on these 2 points.
Well, Axel, maybe let me start. And I think the first question is the difficult one. I hope maybe someone else can answer that, about the legality of plurilateral agreements and how to reach agreement here. In my personal view, if the plurilateral agreements are open at all stages to non-members, and if the things that are negotiated are based on an inclusive way of negotiating, meaning being MFN, in my view, they are compatible with WTO law. I think, but this is my view. I mean, this is different from getting a consensus among the WTO membership, but I think this is the path to go. They need to be inclusive and they need to be open to all members. And I don't see any problems with WTO rules. But India and South Africa have a fundamental opposition to plurilateral agreements. In my view, this is because they fear that the Doha Development Round, which is most important to these two countries, will get diminished focus when we only negotiate these sectors that are interesting, particularly for developed countries. And therefore, I think the only way to find an agreement here is through political political discussion. It's not, in my view, a legal discussion, but more a political discussion, which means you have to address the fears that there are important topics which relate a lot of times to agriculture or food export barriers or food protection will go on the sidelines if you just focus on the few issues that are part of the plurilaterals. And I think here we have an interesting start of discussion by the new WTO Director General. Subsidies is an issue that's interesting to everyone, and not only industrial subsidies, but also agricultural subsidies. And if you put this focus on, you might get new motivation to start the agriculture talks that are part of the Doha round. So in my view, it's a political conflict. You can also maybe integrate the waiver question. That's also part of the deal, and maybe find a political solution on plurilaterals. But I think it's essential because I don't see many room for multilateral progress, and I think we need the plurilateral agreements. An increase in the number of members always makes it more difficult, although the EU tried to negotiate free trade agreement with only less members, and it wasn't even faster than that. So you can't say everything that's regional bilateral goes faster. But I think even though it is more difficult, that doesn't mean we must not try. Because if plurilateral is the way to move forward, and this is my view, then we need to make them inclusive. We cannot just have a couple of leading countries going forward with rules. We need to integrate as many countries as possible, particularly also from the developing countries. And this is why I think you need to take this conflict into account, that it might take longer, but that you need to have a more inclusive group of countries moving forward.
Thank you, Claudia. If I may add to the point raised by Rolf Langhammer, obviously having fewer members negotiating these plurilaterals is one part, but the other part of the plurilaterals is that they focus on one particular issue. And so that could also mean that it's easier to negotiate this limited set of issues. Obviously, Claudia already described that there's a bigger package which should also be taken into account, in particular the Doha development around issues. And I believe Claudia already mentioned another question raised by Archana Negi, in particular on this specific aspect. From the panel, from the virtual panel, who would like to come in on this point? Carlos, please go ahead.
No, I think this is a key issue in terms of the future of the multilateral trade system, because we all know that from a legal point of view, if we look back at the Marrakesh Agreement, and particularly its Article 9 or 10, there is a need for consensus from a legal point of view. So it's not only a question, that's why the joint initiatives are being challenged by some countries, in the sense that even if they adopted on an MFN basis, this would not be enough if you don't have consensus. So what to do? One, if we are going to do this within the WTO framework, is to seek consensus, which is not easy, as we all know. And then to get these new agreements into Annex 4 of the Marrakesh Agreement in the context of Article 10. Other is to do outside the WTO. I would not recommend, but it's a reality. If we don't see progress, we are going to see again and again attempts to go outside the WTO, as was envisaged by the TISA agreement, right? And in this context, the last option would be amendment of Article 10 of the Marrakesh Agreement. Not easy either. But one thing that I strongly believe is the old saying that the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. At this point in time, we really need to challenge some of the rules if we are going to have progress.
Thank you very much, Carlos, also for your thoughts. I'd like to introduce the next question by Radoslav Shevchik, and please apologize if I pronounce the name not correctly. Radoslav asked about natural resources and climate change. I mean, also two very important issues that also have important linkages to trade. So if I may, Annabelle, may I ask you to give a little bit of a sense of what is taking place at the WTO with regard to these two key issues, natural resources and climate change?
So thank you very much, Axel. So on November last year, December last year, a number of countries came together to identify potential issues for discussion on the relationship between trade and environment and trade and sustainability, including, for example, on issues like plastics or the circular economy, for example. And those negotiations are ongoing. Likewise, in parallel, and there one result could be plurilateral initiatives on one or more areas. In parallel, members are discussing a declaration on trade and environment for the next ministerial. We still don't know how discussions will progress in this area, but I do believe that the role of trade in supporting the objective of zero net emissions by 2050 will become increasingly relevant, and we hear more voices here at the WTO for thinking about how can the WTO in particular contribute to this to addressing this important objective. In terms of natural resources, is part of this conversation, if you wish, as well.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. So there was also a question by our colleague Bozkurt Arad, who was also a member of the T20 a couple of years back, and Bozkurt is asking a very challenging question. Is there still hope in multilateralism? And I'd like to ask Mr. Faganello what he thinks about it, because Bozkurt is also referring to the multilateral cooperation and also the success, if you like, in the area of corporate taxation, where more than 100 countries came together to agree on a minimum global tax, for example. So, in your view, is there still hope in multilateral cooperation, and in particular, obviously, with regard to the role of the G20?
Thank you. You are asking me a very easy question, but anyway, I think we all are here because we have hope in the multilateral trade system. So my answer is yes, although it's of course an answer which also has a lot of wishful thinking component, let's say. But I think this, as I mentioned before, the G20 discussions now and in the ministerial conference at the end of the year will be key moments, particularly for the multilateral trade system and for the system in WTO as it is now. Of course, things can always change. The system can be transformed, reformed, as you mentioned before. So there is still always room for changing and improvement. To make it short, I think there is hope, but it depends very much. I think first on the commitment of the member of the countries, or the big members, but all the members, being the WTO an inclusive and consensus-based process and organization is necessary to have all together on board. And on the other, and also we have to be realistic. As I mentioned before, the scenario now in the discussion on the T20 working group, if you look at comparing to the big questions on plurilateral, SDTs and other issues, it's less exciting, maybe less interesting, but to keep the ball rolling and the process going on, we have to focus on realistic issues in order to still have the playing field, in order to to improve and reform and keep the multilateral trade system interesting and challenging enough to keep it alive. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I also think that this is the key role of forums like the G7 or G20, to keep the ball rolling and to keep having dialogue and having frank discussions about the key and challenging issues we are all facing. So thank you very much for your response. I'd like to pick another question by Rolf Langhammer on SDT. Rolf is asking, why shouldn't we reach out to the World Bank and the IMF to help to really come up with criteria who qualifies for SDT and which country does not? So Jingquan, what do you make of this suggestion?
Thank you for the question. Of course, the World Bank and the IMF are very qualified to be consulted with the issue of balance of payments. But right now, trade negotiations actually cover a wide range of issues. This is why we propose this pragmatic and issue-by-issue approach, which means that for different issues, the answers are different. So I'm not sure whether the World Bank and IMF are qualified to answer the questions like like a data flow or the localization of data equipments. So so again, as I said, the SDT issue or the development state issue is very complicated and should be treated specifically issue by issue. I'm not saying that the World Bank and IMF are not good enough, but again, I think for different issues, we should find a different approach.
Thank you very much, Jingquan. And I believe if you, for example, look at the investment facilitation for development discussions, such a more issue by issue approach to the development dimension is already taken. In particular, when it, for example, also the trade facilitation agreement also provided an interesting blueprint that could be used in these discussions. So I already see momentum on the issues that you are proposing. Okay, I think we've covered most of the question, if not all, but I'd like to conclude with a quick round around the virtual table here before I hand over to Said Ahmad for his concluding remarks. I'd like to have a quick round and ask each of the panelists and speakers what he or she wishes, or what her or his key wishes are for the trade ministers and for the G20 leaders when they meet in a couple of weeks' time on T20 reform. So what are your key wishes? Should we perhaps start in the reverse order and start with Annabelle?
So I think my most important wish for the next ministerial relates to a topic that is not directly linked to WTO reform, but it is in a way very much linked, which is I hope for a successful negotiation in the area of fishery subsidies, because this will confirm that the negotiation function of the WTO is alive.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Mr. Faganello.
Thank you, Axel. Oh, I agree, of course, with the Deputy Director General. This is on the substance. This is the most, I think, important issue on the table now. also because of its relations to one of the questions I just saw on the Q&A, which is the sustainability environmental issue. So there's a connection there, a direct connection with the issue of sustainability and modernizing the rule book of WTO. This, of course, is my personal view, not the G20 position, but I think this is probably the most important issue. And I think many members of G20 recognize this as a very important issue. And at the same time, we should, as I mentioned before, also realize the need to start a process reform. So to get, hopefully, also from the G20 discussion, a push in this direction. So to these two issues, it will be also important, I think, something we will get out of for the trade and health part, trade and health nexus, which is a very, as you know, current and important issue all over the world. And so we also contribute to show that the multilateral trade system and WTO is dealing with the practical, concrete issues that are in the interest of the more general public opinion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faganello. Jinkwan, what are your key wish for the policymakers at
Okay. For me, I think the most critical issue for the WTO is to revive the appellate body and the dispute settlement function. Today, we are talking more about making new rules and the negotiating function. But if the existing rules are not respected or reinforced, why would we bother to make new rules? Who would trust the commitments made by the members? So I wish that the G20 should deliver a clear message that those big members would comply with the existing rules and respect the judicial system of the WTO.
Thank you very much, Jinkwan. Carlos, what's on your wish list?
Well, I feel a little bit like Danny Kaye, that once went to a conference and before him, the Indian ambassador made a wonderful speech. So when he came to the podium, he just said, I wrote that speech. So I basically agree with what Jinkwan Tu just mentioned. Now, I fully agree that progress in the negotiations on fisheries and trade and health are very important achievables for the MC12, and the effort in having progress in this area is very welcome. But again, as was mentioned, the G20 could send a strong message about the fundamental role of the dispute settlement system in terms of the rules of the game, and to put an end to this issue about the crisis of the appellate body.
Clear message. Thank you very much. So, Claudia, what's top of your wish list?
Well, it's always bad to be the last speaker because you can basically just repeat what was said before. I think the most important thing is huge commitment to MC12. People lost confidence in the WTO. It took a long time when COVID started to get together to manage things in the pandemic. And I think the WTO needs to show that it can solve things and that it's relevant. And this is why we need a huge commitment to have fisheries, as was said before. Appellate body, I think we have still a lot of problems with the current US government on that, but at least, as Annabelle mentioned, to have a work program on how to solve the appellate body crisis is important. So these two things, fisheries and work program on appellate body. But, and here's my wish for the plurilaterals, because this is what we felt was really important, maybe get a common sense on whether we need plurilaterals, how they should be so they fit into the WTO framework, because I think it's necessary that they are part of the WTO framework. And we have all the relevant players and at the G20, and maybe use this informal forum to get some kind of consensus or understanding how to move forward with plurilaterals.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And so I won't give the concluding remarks. That will my colleague Said Akman will do that. So I'll keep it short. Thank you very much for your very inspiring thoughts. Thank you very much to the participants for joining us, for participating actively in the discussion. Thanks for your challenging questions, and I hope that this is part of a longer process where we as T20 thinkers and think tankers are engaging with key policymakers. And hopefully this discussion continues. And yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the publication of our policy briefs. Just keep a close eye on the T20 Italy website, and let us know what you think about our recommendations. You typically, our emails, so please get in touch. Zeit, you're concluding.
Thank you, Axel. Well, the reforming WTO is a very tough issue and very difficult sometimes to reconcile the differences among the stakeholders. Sometimes they have very challenging demands from the system, but the system is not designed to provide every answer to the questions and problems, but we should look at the part of the glass which is full, because we are not inventing the world again. We have a lot of rules. We need new rules. And some of the rules were already drawn in some regional agreements or mega agreements that I understand from this discussion today and our policy briefs that we have points to learn also from the experience of the same stakeholders in other fora like regional agreements, and which of these particular disciplines could be improved with respect to new rules at the multilateral level. This brings us to some procedural aspects, how to bring new rules and negotiations and further trade liberalization within the WTO. Yes, the plurilaterals could be one issue, and this is important that we should not keep aside. The problem with the plurilaterals, as far as I see, also in this discussion today, is very much relevant to willingness of parties and how willing they are. Not all of them are at the same level, and largely because some of the stakeholders have capacity problems. The other part of the problem is that maybe they do not want to be a part of it in the later stages, because many of the issues will be settled by then and their interests will be harmed. So we have to assure that the system also works to bring more inclusivity and to consider the problems or the capacity challenges of these countries, as some of them are G20 countries, as we see in the policy briefs. The second and the last point I would like to raise here is that just mere publication of such policy briefs and their discussion is not sufficient to ensure that policy recommendations are brought to the attention of decision makers. This was a very stimulating event for me that I learned also from Mr. Faganello and Mr. Gonzalez about what's going on in the working group, G20 working group on trade and investment, and also with respect to plurilaterals in the WTO. But I think we should continue such kind of interactions in different environments also to bring much better policies based on research. That's, I call it as research-based policy-making process. And I think this is what T20 is for, and T20 Italy was working for this, not only for trade, but also for other issues. And I would like to thank all the participants, the audience, Mr. Faganello, Ms. Gonzalez, and panelists, and you, Axel, and the Institute of FARE for organizing this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and have a nice, good rest of the day.